Hi, welcome. My name is Sabrina Roberts, and I am a senior international politics and economics major at Middlebury College. This is the fourth episode of the MIDDVantage Career on Capitol Hill series, and today we will be focusing on authorizations and the floor. And with us today, we have Charlie Arnowitz, class of 2013, who works as a senior legislative assistant in the House of Representatives. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for starters, maybe you could share with us a little bit about your career path and the decision-making process behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up a little bit outside Chicago and graduated from Middlebury in 2013. At Mid, I majored in poli-sci, minored in Chinese, was very involved in the student government and a number of other student organizations. I did a couple of internships during my time there. I worked at Senator Leahy's district office up in Burlington. That was actually a J-term internship, so I took the ACTR every morning at like 6 a.m. in the dead of Vermont winter, so I was committed. And I also did an internship at the Department of Commerce in DC at their Office of Legislative Affairs. Throughout my time at Mid, and I did a bunch of different stuff and really loved that experience. But my short-term career goal was to work on Capitol Hill. One of the reasons that I ended up not doing that right away was because it was really important to me, and I would imagine a number of rising seniors feel the same way. It was really important to me to graduate with a job in hand. And that's something that's a little bit difficult to do on the Hill. We can talk a little bit more about that later. And so what I did instead was I got a year-long fellowship at an organization called the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And they do a lot of domestic policy advocacy work in DC. It was a legislative fellowship. So I did that for a year, got a lot of really great experience on advocacy and what things look like from outside the Hill. But towards the end of that fellowship, I did want to move to Capitol Hill. And I will tell you, my first job on the Hill was really a lot of luck. I did an informational interview with a Senate Chief of Staff and got a call a couple of hours after that interview, basically offering me a temporary job for a few months. It was July at that point. It was through, I think, the end of the year. That temporary job turned into 3 years with Senator Warner. I then moved over to the House side, where I worked for Congressman Andre Carson, who represents Indianapolis, for a couple of years. And more recently, for the last year or so, year and a half, I've been with Congressman Jimmy Gomez, who represents downtown Los Angeles.
So in your day-to-day activities at work now, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the first thing to sort of think about is, what is the job? So there are a lot of different roles in a Capitol Hill office. There are folks who do communications. There are folks who do office operations. There are folks who schedule for the member. I am on the legislative staff. And so basically what that means is I have a set of issue areas that I work on for the member. And I am sort of the point person on all of those issues for anything that the member might do on those issues. So, no day really is, no 2 days are really the same. So it's going to be everything from just making sure I'm up to date, tracking those issues, tracking legislation, what's happening on those issues. I'll be taking lots and lots of meetings, or in this era of COVID, calls and video meetings and the like, on those issue areas, responding to folks asking what the member's position is on those areas, and developing those positions to some extent. I'll be briefing the member, making sure he knows what's going on those issues. Sometimes we'll have to have a conversation about what his position is on those issues, and making sure he understands the implications. Sometimes we'll be writing legislation. Those tend to be longer term projects, although sometimes those turnarounds are shorter. And that's a complex process. Preparing for hearings and other committee business, Those are just a few of the things one might do in a given week.
Great, thanks so much for sharing. And I think that's really helpful for all the Middlebury kids who are listening. But maybe we can move on towards like that topic of today, which is authorizations and the floor. So maybe to begin, would you be able to give a quick rundown of the process of how a bill becomes a law and maybe how long this process takes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the short version, you might know from Schoolhouse Rock, more or less a member of Congress or a senator will introduce a bill. The bill will be considered by committee, subsequently go to the floor. It'll be looked at by the other body, whether the Senate or the House. And ultimately, after they reconcile their differences, it'll go to the president for his signature or veto. That process can take anything from a couple of days to a decade. It really varies and it depends on the issue at hand. There have been bills that have been introduced and reintroduced many, many sessions of Congress and never really end up going there. They can be small or large. On the other hand, something like the CARES Act, which was a massive multi-trillion-dollar spending package, was signed into law really within a week or two of when the process began. So it can vary pretty substantially.
Great. So getting into the first process, you talked about the bill being introduced. When a bill is created, who drafts it and what is the drafting process like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So members of Congress or senators, they're the ones who can introduce bills. So that'll be, a combination of the member, him or herself, or the staffer. If my member is really interested in a particular issue, I might, look for some legislative items to move within that issue. Sometimes, though, the member will have a really specific idea of what should become a bill. So that's just sort of in terms of who initiates the process. More generally, the first thing you're going to want to do is explore the territory, right? So what else has been introduced in that space? What are ideas that people have, right? So you might be doing a lot of research. You might be consulting with what in DC speak we call stakeholders, right? So anyone who might have an interest in the bill, whether that's lobbyists, folks from a think tank, constituents, any of the above. The next thing you're going to want to do is translate those ideas into legislative text. That process sometimes is very easy and sometimes can be more complex depending on the topic. Congress actually has a special staff who works for all the members called the Office of Legislative Counsel. And their job really is to work with the members' personal staffs to translate sort of into legislative language. You also might be working with the Congressional Budget Office in order to understand how they'll view the budgetary and policy impacts of your legislation. You might be working with the Committee of Jurisdiction, and I think we're going to talk about committees later, but it's better to have their buy-in sooner rather than later. You might even be working with the administration to obtain technical assistance, since they're often the ones who will be implementing the bill. So that's sort of the drafting itself. And then the next sort of piece is you want support. So that comes from really two key places. First, your fellow members of Congress, and members of Congress can co-sponsor bills, which is an indication of support, and also from organizations who might endorse the bill. And that's a way of demonstrating both to other members of Congress and to the general public that lots of people think it's a good idea.
Great, that makes sense. Thank you. And I guess you mentioned committees just now when you were explaining a little bit. What is a committee?
Yeah, so a committee is a group of members chaired by usually, but not always, the most senior member of that committee, which has jurisdiction over a particular topic. So basically what that means is every bill that goes through Congress on the topics over which they have jurisdiction, they're the ones who sort of consider it it's the interim step in between introduction and the floor.
Okay, so let's say a member introduces a bill, they went through the process that you talked about earlier, they got support, etc. Who decides which committee it goes to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that the House employs and the Senate does as well, a number of nonpartisan officials who make determinations like that, as well as adjudicate things like floor procedure. The clerk is the individual who decides which bills go where, but there isn't a whole lot of discretion. Generally, it's pretty clear based on the subject matter jurisdiction.
And then, so once the bill gets to the committee, does the committee alter the text of the bill? How much altering do they end up doing?
Yeah, it really can vary. So committees basically meet in one of two ways, right? They might have a hearing, and that's like what you'll often see on C-SPAN for those of you who tune in regularly to C-SPAN, right? It'll be members of Congress asking witnesses questions about a particular topic. Witnesses will testify, and then members will ask questions. And that's sort of committees in fact-finding mode. The other sort of mode in which the committee might meet is what's known as a markup. And markups are basically what they sound like. They take a piece of legislation and they mark it up. And that's when you'll have the amendment process and members can, make amendments in committee to a bill. And those are voted on just like anything else. So if majority support on a committee exists to change the bill, then that can happen. And amendments can happen later on the floor too, but committee is really the easiest place to do that. The other thing to note is, generally speaking, in both the House and Senate, the chairs of the committees have a lot of say over not only what legislation even gets a markup at committee, but also sort of how things are marked up in committee and what the actual outcome might be.
So do certain committees pass more bills than others, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing to realize is the vast majority of bills that are introduced never get considered. There are up to 10,000 bills introduced every session of Congress. Hundreds get passed within a given chamber. Fewer, obviously, make it into law, but that's a pretty small fraction. So the committee, the chair of the committee does have jurisdiction, have the ability to determine whether or not they'll mark up a bill at all. In terms of how active committees are, I think there are a lot of pieces to that, right? So some committees have broader jurisdiction than others, and some are narrower. For example, in the House, the Ways and Means Committee has jurisdiction over the entire tax code, trade, Medicare, Social Security, a number of social welfare programs. So that's a lot of stuff. There are other committees, and I don't want to pick on any, but they have narrower jurisdiction, and so in some ways there's just less to do. That said, for every committee there are more bills introduced than they're able to really process. I mean, the other piece of it though is members of Congress and their staffs are human, right? So just like some classes might be more work than others, some committees are more productive than others. Political factors might shape that, but also just the reality of Congress being made up of people.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I guess we've all heard about places where bills go to die. So it was great that you touched on the fact that a lot of bills are introduced, but a lot of them don't even make it past the committee process. So I guess, let's say a bill does make it past the committee, and it goes to get voted on in both the House and then on the Senate, vice versa. What does this process look like?
You mean the process of voting?
Yeah, the process of voting.
Got it. Yeah. So I mean, I think the first thing to realize is not all bills that are passed by committee even go to the floor. So it's really a series of bottlenecks, and floor time in both the House and Senate is pretty valuable. The physical voting process looks pretty different during COVID. There's sort of they sort of take shifts right now in order to socially distance. So let's just talk about what things look like normally in the hopes that, we'll all be going back to normal soon. Members of Congress don't usually spend much time on the floor. You know, they might be among the world's greatest deliberative bodies, but there isn't so much deliberating that goes on day to day. Generally, what happens is when votes are called, bells ring throughout the Capitol and in the House and Senate office buildings, and they'll rush back from wherever they are, whatever they're doing. Sometimes they're not even in the Capitol complex, and they usually have 15, 20 minutes to get to the floor for that first vote. You may have heard of the subways that run in the basement of the Capitol. So the subways, which are very, very short subways, are pretty crowded at that time. So you really do have members rushing to the floor. Physically, in the House, members vote electronically. They each have a pin and a device. The Senate is manual. So members will relay their votes to the clerk. In the Affordable Care Act repeal debate, John McCain very famously gave the thumb, you can't really see it on the screen, but the thumb down, and he was giving that literally to the clerk in order for him or her to tally their vote. The other thing to realize when it comes to voting is there are multiple votes for a single bill. The House and Senate have different procedures, but speaking just in terms of the House, for example, if we're going to be voting on a bill, there's several votes that go into that, right? So first is the rule under which we'll be debating the bill. Then there's the previous question, which is basically saying, okay, are we ready to vote? There's the motion to recommit, which is the opposition's last chance to amend the bill. And then there's final passage of the bill itself. And bills can be considered in slightly different ways. Bills that are expected to pass unanimously or with more than 2/3 support, it's a little bit of a faster process. But that's sort of the basic outline of voting.
What about filibustering? I've heard about that, but I'm not sure. How does it fit into the whole process?
Yeah, so filibustering only happens in the Senate. It doesn't happen in the House. And the reason for that is the House basically operates on the principle of majority rule. If you have the majority in the House, you can really do whatever you, more or less whatever you want. The Senate operates on a different principle. Under Senate rules, they operate under unanimous consent, which gives every senator quite a lot of power. The filibuster itself is, and I am by no means an expert on Senate parliamentary procedure, but it's basically an accident of history in the way Senate rules work. So a lot of folks say, it comes from our founding fathers. Well, that's not quite the case, although it's been a practice for a long time. But basically, under Senate rules, senators can talk as long as they want on the topic they're speaking about, unless 3/5 of the senators bring debate to a close in a process that's known as cloture. And cloture is just a fancy Old English word for closure. So we can call it that too. But basically cloture brings debate to an end, and it starts the process to move to that final passage vote. Until recent decades, this was not something that was necessary. You didn't have members basically threatening to filibuster, which requires cloture votes on most bills. So that's a relatively recent sort of development. At the same time, though, the most famous filibuster in history is Strom Thurmond's filibuster against the Civil Rights Act. We've also got examples like Ted Cruz, reading Green Eggs and Ham on the Senate floor. But most filibusters don't actually involve talking. It's really the threat of a filibuster that makes these cloture votes necessary. There are a couple of exceptions when the filibuster doesn't apply, but generally speaking, it has fundamentally changed the character of the Senate.
Great, thank you. Another thing that I'm thinking about that might also complicate the voting process is if we're in an election year, for example, and do the types of bills that Congress takes up differs if we are in an election year, or does anything else change? Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question. So, generally it's the party leadership in both the House and the Senate that will determine what bills come to the floor. If I'm the majority leader of the House or of the Senate, I'm very concerned with remaining the majority leader and not becoming the minority leader. And so absolutely, just like there are many sort of factors that go into bills coming to the floor during normal times, an election is definitely an important factor. Generally speaking, Congress is in session less frequently in the months before an election. It's more often sort of district work periods where members will be spending time in their districts. But also, bills are likelier to be focused on messaging. The regular appropriations process doesn't usually happen in an election year. Normally, both houses of Congress will pass a continuing resolution, which sort of enables them to kick the can down the road on appropriations. So things do look a little bit different, but generally, things still operate.
Great, thank you. And then I guess we've also talked a little bit about voting in the House and voting in the Senate. Perhaps you could share a little bit about how these happen. Do they happen at the same time? Which one goes first?
Yeah, so they operate totally independently. And so a bill can either start in the House or the Senate. There's an exception in the Constitution for bills that raise revenue, but generally speaking, bills can start in either place. If a bill passes, say, the House, the Senate is under no obligation to vote on it. And in fact, we're seeing that very often during the current session of Congress, with partisan control of each chamber divided. So, there's no rhyme or reason because they operate totally independently.
Okay, so once the bill has been voted on in both the House and the Senate, then I think you mentioned it goes to a conference committee. What is a conference committee and what happens there?
Yeah, so because the chambers operate independently, it is somewhat rare for bills actually to go to conference committee in this day and age. If there is what's known as a four corners agreement, meaning House majority, House minority, Senate majority, Senate minority beforehand, then they'll just pass identical bills, and it's not necessary to even go to conference committee. That said, there are situations where conference committees are pretty regular. One example is the National Defense Authorization Act, which has passed every year for I want to say more than 50 years running. And there will be conference committees to reconcile differences between those bills. And those are pretty sought after slots for members to be on the conference committee. But again, they don't happen on probably the majority of bills now.
And then the last stage I think you talked about was the presidential action or the president signing the bill. What does that process look like, and how often does the president veto something?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that even though in the Constitution, the president doesn't sort of come into the action until the end, the administration is involved throughout the process. So, first, because they're the ones who have to implement the bill. So as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes they'll be providing technical assistance, things like that. But also because they're an important sort of pressure point in the political system, in the legislative system. And so you want their buy-in early so that the president signs the bill. Towards the end of the process, usually when a floor vote has been announced, the administration will release what's known as a SAP, or Statement of Administration Policy. And that basically says, well, if the bill were to be presented to the president, his advisors would recommend that he do X, which gives the president a little bit of discretion, but basically is seen as a pretty strong signal of where the president is. How often does a veto take place? It happens sometimes, and it happens more often when partisan control is divided between Congress and the presidency. But unless you have, for example, both the House and the Senate controlled by one party and the presidency by another, and I think the last time that would have happened would have been, from 2010 to 14. Other than that, vetoes don't happen super frequently because the bill gets stopped somewhere else, whether that's, before committee or on the floor or when it moves over to the other body. But obviously it does happen. The reason it's not as common as it could be is because, people plan for it. So you sort of work to avoid it throughout.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing all your wisdom about authorizations and the floor. I think this has been really helpful. Maybe to wrap up this discussion, would you have any advice for Middlebury students who are looking to work on the Hill?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would just say to folks is this is a fun job. There are a lot of really exciting and cool opportunities to make an impact when you leave Mid. I will say for me, being able to have the sorts of opportunities that you have so soon after graduating and within the first few years of your career is somewhat unique to the Hill, and one of the reasons I think it's such a special place. It's important to be willing to work hard. The entry-level jobs on the Hill tend not to be very fun. Usually the sort of lowest rung on the totem pole is a staff assistant in an office, and that person is responsible for things like greeting visitors and answering phones. And even the next rung up usually involves sort of a lot of mail writing and things like that. But one thing to realize is that folks on the Hill tend to, who do well, they tend to move up quickly. And while you might feel overqualified for your first job, you're almost definitely not going to be overqualified, and you're probably going to be underqualified from your second or third or fourth one. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Other stuff, networking is certainly helpful, and I know it's not a lot of fun. But networking can be all sorts of things, right? It can be having conversations with Middlebury alums, but it can also be thinking about, who are your home state senators or representatives? And are there folks you can reach out to there? There are a lot of ways to sort of do that. So I think, be willing to learn, be willing to work hard. But I think these are really fun jobs to have.
Great. Thanks so much, Charlie, and to everyone else who has been watching. Stay tuned for the next episode of this series, which will be coming out soon. Thank you.